few years ago, about 4 years ago, I was sitting in a room, and my career was about to take a major turn. I'd been making commercial video games for 25 years or so at some of the biggest companies on some very, very successful franchises, made a lot of money for a lot of people. And I thought I knew what this word meant. It means the money I don't have yet, right? Stock options, RSUs, whatever it might be. That's what equity is. But I was in the room with a bunch of people who were putting together a new project, a startup. It was going to be a nonprofit. We worked very closely with the games industry to create educational games for kids. And this project became something called Glass Lab, which some of you might have heard of. So I'm sitting around the table, and we're making the plans for it. And one of the people from one of the foundations who was sponsoring it said, let's not forget about equity when we're talking about this. And I raised my hand, and I said, why equity? I thought this was a nonprofit. And she looked at me and was very kind and said, no, MJ, I mean, like, can poor kids get to play the games? So I realized very quickly that I had a very different definition of equity that I needed to work with. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And specifically, I want to ask this question. Does everyone have equal access to the games industry? The games industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the world. It's incredibly important. It's a huge growing piece of the economy, and it's very exciting. And I think it's worthwhile for us to start asking ourselves this question. I've been asking myself this question for 4 years. And I have a lot of insights and thoughts I want to share with you all today. Specifically, this is something that everybody who's in the game industry can think about. And it's because of this. When you get hired, a lot of times your employer will tell you what your most important role is. Your most important role at this company, they'll say, is participating in the hiring of more people. And in fact, Valve, in their famous 2012 employee manual, made this very explicit. Hiring is the most important thing in the universe, they said. Apparently, even more important than playing Dota 2. So when you walk into this company, you're going to be participating in hiring, most likely, if you have any tenure there at all, which means that all this actually applies to you. So how do we get people? When I started thinking through this, I identified 4 vectors that we mostly get people into the game industry. You need to grow your company's getting bigger, maybe you're starting a new company. These are the 4 places. Competitive hires, somebody's working at another company, I would like to bring them here. Network hires, somebody I already know. University hires, somebody who's maybe just graduating from school. And then everybody else. Well, let's go through that. So let's first look at competitive hires. What I see is an industry that's pretty obsessed with this as a way of hiring. And I actually went and decided to prove it. I went to 16 of the top companies I can think of. I went to their websites and looked at their job listings for design. I found the most junior listing they had for design. If the company didn't have any junior listings, I just skipped over them. So this would be an associate designer, junior designer, something like that. And the average of experience they were requiring was 2.8 years. So what that says is if you haven't been working in the industry for 3 years, I don't know how you get to be a game designer. There were 3 exceptions to this. 3 companies had made it very explicit that they were interested in bringing in new people who had not worked in the game industry before and wanting to mentor them. Those 3 companies were Blizzard, Riot, and King. And I found that really interesting because those are also the 3 companies, or at least 2 of the 3, that my students at UC Santa Cruz most want to work for. Not coincidence. All right, now let's talk about network hires. This is a little harder to quantify, right? It's harder to say exactly how many people, you don't put in the job listing, must know me, even though you might mean it. But it turns out we can quantify it because JobVite, the job listing website, they did some research. They went and called a bunch of recruiters and asked what their favorite way of getting candidates is, and 78% said referrals. Here's another bit of data also from JobVite. This is where they're looking at actual hires. 40% of hires come through employee referrals. Now, this is everybody that gets a job through JobVite. This isn't the game industry. This isn't even the tech industry. This is everybody that gets a job through JobVite. It's 40%. And did a little more research and found that Quartz.com had made some calls when they saw these numbers. They asked some tech companies and saw that the number was about 75% in Silicon Valley tech companies. 75% of hires come from somebody that knows somebody already in the company. I would say the game industry is probably somewhere in between those 40 and 75% numbers. So what does that tell us? It tells us that our score on this is not very good. That mostly the people that are getting in the industry are not getting in unless they already are in the industry or already know somebody in the industry. We can look at the other two pieces as well. So I'm currently the program director at a master's degree program at UC Santa Cruz. I pay a lot of attention to the university hiring question. And I can tell you, and I've also, when I was working at Electronic Arts, made a lot of hires through the university programs. They're great. Internships are great. Internships are a great way for new people to get into the industry. Here's the problem. Most companies, if they have an internship program, like to maintain a relationship with a very small number of universities, and only people that are in those universities actually have access. People that are going to any other university don't. And actually, some of the interesting chatter that's going on right now around diversity is if you look at the numbers of African American and Latino graduates in engineering from top universities and then compare them to the number getting hired by tech companies, it's about half compared to whites. In other words, there are plenty of graduates, but they're not getting hired. And I would contend that a lot of this is because the relationships are with a very limited number of universities that are probably not the ones graduating those numbers. It's not a judgment of quality, it's just access. And then everyone else, right? Are we getting those folks? So let's talk about that later. Here's another way of looking at it. Let's look at it as a funnel. Basically, we're saying, are you already in the industry? That's the top of the funnel. And then really doesn't matter. Like, if you're not already in the industry, I'm not interested in you. That's the message that we're sending to people that would like to come into the game industry. In general, the way we source people is not, by that definition, very equitable. We're not giving access to people not in the industry. All right, let's talk about hiring practices. Generally, I don't think that the game industry does a bad job of hiring once we get people into our ecosystem. But I do want to talk a little bit about what I'll call the meritocracy myth. And I'll tell this through an anecdote. We rely a lot on coding tests in this business, a lot. And I know this, especially at the entry level, because my students who want to get a job almost always have to take a coding test, even for just a more technical design position. When I was working in education, I got to work pretty closely with ETS. ETS is the company that makes the SAT. They make all those standardized tests that you kids hate to take. Now, I learned a lot of things. One is that the SAT is actually almost 100 years old. It was invented in 1926 in what we now call the progressive era of the United States. The whole intent of the SAT was to allow poorer kids more access to college. Somebody had noticed that only rich kids got to go to college. If we could create a standardized exam that would be more meritocratic, more kids could go to college from different backgrounds. And honestly, it's pretty well worked. We've seen a lot different, I think this has had a huge impact in this country, of different backgrounds of kids being able to go to college. At the same time, however, it's very imperfect. And the College Board, who's the company that actually administers the test, published this data from 2014. There's an absolutely linear relationship between your SAT score and your parents' income. And here's the same data just presented a slightly different way, showing the delta for different income levels. This is from 2014. Now, the College Board published this because they know it's a problem, and they're not trying to run away from it. They don't know how to fix it. But a lot of what's in there is the bias of what's in the tests. I'll give you an example. They identified the word regatta was asked in vocabulary. Who knows regatta? A lot of the folks in this room. Hey, how about just about everybody that's in a wealthy family on the East Coast? But does poor families somewhere in the South know the word regatta? They really don't. And that doesn't mean the kid is less smart or less capable. It means they don't know the word regatta. So they took that word out, but it's the point being that this is a process that has to be constantly revised and always has bias. Every assessment, I don't care how meritocratic you think it is, has bias. There's another funny thing that goes on. So I ask employers to tell me, because I'm teaching at a university, what do you want? What do you want for a successful employee? What should I be teaching these kids? What do you suppose they tell me? They say coding. That's not what they say first. I want a good team player. I want a good problem solver. I want a good collaborator. I want, oh, right, yeah, they better have the technical skills too. Then they go and interview, and it looks like this. So this is what it should look like. This is what they're telling me. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, gotcha. And then they interview them, and it looks like that. And then once again, who cares about the rest of it? If you don't get past the coding test, you don't get through. Now, I understand why this is, and it's a scale thing. I was looking at one of the coding tests. Anyone use these online coding test services? I'm trying to remember the name of one called Codely or something like that. They were proudly announcing their 3.5 millionth coding test over the weekend. 3.5 million coding tests given through this service. It's about scale, and I get it. It's a really good way, an easy way to filter people, but don't get carried away with it is kind of my point. Your instinct is actually probably more valuable than your tools, and be careful. Okay, lastly, the pipeline problem. So I was preparing this talk last weekend, and Facebook announced their latest diversity numbers. And this pretty much hit the fan, because their diversity numbers went from terrible last year to identically terrible this year. And Facebook then said, the problem is the pipeline. We can't get enough qualified candidates that fit these other diversity categories, besides basically white males and Asian males, right? The internet had a field day with that, as the internet is wont to do. And to a certain degree, they're correct. Blaming the pipeline is kind of like blaming another part of the system and not trying to fix yourself. And I think some of that criticism is accurate. On the other hand, I did go and actually read Facebook's report, and they made some pretty meaningful commitments to the pipeline. They gave $15 million to code.org. Does anyone know what code.org is? Okay, code.org is one of the most amazing things that's happened in the United States in the last 5 years, in my opinion. It is a nonprofit organization that has created a bunch of online tools for kids to learn how to code. And they've done a brilliant job. They created something called the Hour of Code. Who's heard of the Hour of Code? All right, a little more. They had something like 2 million American kids complete the Hour of Code. And we're talking about very young elementary, middle school age kids. They've gotten a bunch of celebrities involved. Chris Bosh talks about what a great coder he was in college. It's a big deal. Facebook gave them $15 million, which to Facebook is not a lot of money, but to code.org is a huge amount of money. Facebook also announced something called Facebook University, which they've been running for a couple years, where they bring in underrepresented young people, they mentor them, and it's sort of a pseudo-internship program, and for the first time, they're converting some of those people to full-time. Now, that's like, what, 5 people? It's not gonna change their statistics, but you've gotta start somewhere. And I think people, yes, okay, the critique is real, but you've gotta also look at, are they trying to change the system, and what are they doing to change the system? I wanna talk also about Intel. Intel has committed $300 million to their diversity initiative. And I'm really, really incredibly grateful to say that my program at UC Santa Cruz is a recipient of one of their grants. Because of our Intel grant, 2 women are gonna go get master's degrees next year who would not be able to do that otherwise. And I get choked up because this is a big deal. Yeah, good job, Intel. You know, I'm actually, hopefully within the next few weeks, gonna announce a second partner to do something similar in the following year. You can actually make a change in this. You are companies that have money that can invest in the pipeline. It's a thing you can do. And you know, we're getting good at teaching. We're getting good at preparing these kids for success. But we do need help. State funding for higher education is not what it used to be. It really isn't. And the reality is that going forward, higher education is going to depend on a lot of corporate money to continue to exist. So here's a little summary. Try this. Every time you have a job opening, interview one person that is not qualified. Interview one person, and I mean bring them in, who does not fit your description, doesn't have enough years of experience, doesn't have the right academic credentials, whatever it is, but is really interesting and just might be really cool. Just do it. You don't have to hire them. Just bring them in and interview them. See what happens. Does anyone know what the Rooney Rule is from the NFL? Okay, cool. The Rooney Rule is a rule in the NFL where the organization realized that minorities were not being elevated to coaching positions in that league, despite the fact that there was a lot of minority people that were players. So they just made a simple rule. Before you hire your head coach, you must interview at least one candidate who is from a minority group. That was passed in 2003. By 2006, the coaching staffs had increased from 6% to 22% minority. Didn't require that they hire anybody, just said you have to talk to them. Second thing, look hard at how you're assessing people. Remember that every time you create an assessment, you're creating a funnel, and that funnel's gonna have bias. Think about how you're creating it. Third thing, invest in the pipeline, and I really think there's two options here. One is you can just invest in schools, and we're out there, and we're trying our best, and it's tough work. I don't want everybody to come do what I'm doing, but we're ready to train as many kids as we can. Second thing you can do, though, is you can just bring young people into your company in the same way that Facebook is doing, but you have to commit to mentoring them. You have to commit to, I'm going to develop some of these people. I'm not going to assume that everybody I hire is ready to go out of the box. I will commit to making someone better, and maybe even better than me. And lastly, this is something that I found really interesting. I've spent the last year looking at job listings, feels like every day, because I'm trying to get a sense of how to get my students jobs. And the thread that I see through all these job listings is, I posted a job listing because I have a terrible problem that I need to solve, and I need to solve it as soon as possible. There are very few job listings that say, I'm a growing company, and I want to bring in awesome new people. Every time I see one of those, I get all excited. And I will tell you, I'm going to call them out again. If you go to Riot, and the way that Riot asks for game designers, they ask for people that love League of Legends that can't wait to come in and help. Can't wait to come in and do more stuff. And they don't say, oh my God, everything's on fire. I need 6 server coders before the whole thing falls down, which is what it sounds like when you read most of these job listings. So think about it, like, okay, sure, you're gonna have to hire because of need most of the time, but every once in a while, make a hire because you just want to. Because I just wanna bring in somebody awesome, and I'm gonna find a way to find the headcount to do that. So why do all this? For me, this is a really personal thing. I made a career change 4 years ago where I said I'm not going to be in commercial games anymore. Commercial games have been really good to me, and frankly, I've been that outsider hire most of my career. Right now, I am giving master's degrees to students, and I don't even have a master's degree, whereas I should have a doctorate. Okay? I am unqualified for my position, but the people who I work for found a way to hire me. I like to think that I'm making that pay off for them. That's happened to me over and over again. And I think this is really just, for me, this is personal. It's really valuable. A lot of people who have been in the industry a long time say stuff like this. I would never hire me if I was 22. Well, you should. I should hire me if I was 22, even though I was totally unqualified. So find a way. That's kind of the way I look at it. But I think there's a bigger reason. So if we look at this, and you think, like, where did Will Wright come from? Where did Sid Meier come from? Like, these people, Roberto Williams, these people were outsiders, right? Okay, those were all entrepreneurs. They all started from scratch, except then you get their Shigeru Miyamotos, you get the Amy Hennigs, you get the Takahashis, like these people that were hired into companies. And they're hired as outsiders. And I think this is an industry tradition that's worth preserving and worth enhancing. And then, we can go to university. We've got Genova, we've got Kelly, we've got Asher, Akira. There's all these really exciting, cool people coming out of university as well. Some of whom may not be going to the schools that you're usually kind of considering the usual suspects. So that's really the crux of this argument, is to have a vibrant industry. We can't just keep hiring people with 2.8 years of experience. We can't just keep cycling the same people around a big circle through the industry back and forth. There has to be some way where we're bringing in new people who don't have the preconceptions that we have. And here's the funny thing, is that sounds a lot like equity. It sounds a lot like equal access. People coming from different backgrounds into your company. And that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle, which is what kind of future do we want? Do we want one that maybe some of us don't agree with? Or do we want one that's a little different? So this would be, I'm just going to show you some pictures. The majority of this, almost all this, is kids that I've interacted with over the past few years. And almost every single one of those kids wants to be a game developer. Like almost every single one. And somewhere that dream's getting killed for them, and that's okay, dreams die. But for a lot of them, it's getting killed for the wrong reasons. It's getting killed because they don't have access to the industry the way that I did because I was lucky, and the way that so many of us around us did because they were lucky. They were in the right place at the right time and found a way in. Ultimately, for me, this is like, I love being in the game industry. I love that I've had all the opportunities that I've had. I want every kid out there to have that same opportunity. And that's my argument. Thanks.